Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to this session, which is Free People of Color in New England, and we're going to take the papers in the order in which they're listed in the program. And I'd like at this stage to introduce both of our speakers and our commentator. Our first speaker is Brian Rommel Ruiz, who is Associate Professor of History at Colorado College, received his PhD from the University of Michigan, and is completing a book-length manuscript called Between African and Colored, Afro-American in Rhode Island and Nova Scotia, 1750 to 1840, which is to be published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. The title of his paper today is Creoles and Colonization, African Colonization Movements in Rhode Island and Nova Scotia in the Age of the American Revolution. Our second presenter is Peter Hinks, who is one of the editors of the Frederick Douglass papers at Yale, received his PhD from Yale, and is the author of To Awaken My Afflicted Brethren, which is a biography of Bostonian David Walker. His paper today is He Was Capable of Great Things, William Lanson and the Vagaries of Early Free Black Life in New Haven, Connecticut, 1800 to 1831. Our commentator, John Salient, received his BA, MA, and PhD degrees from Brown. He's currently Professor of English and History at Western Michigan University. He's the author of Black Puritan, Black Republican, and he is the editor of Face Zion Forward. And I'm Julie Winch. I teach in the history department here at wonderful UMass Boston. Okay, so if I could call upon our first presenter, please.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me correctly. And sometimes my voice inflections, I tend to go in and out, so I will try to be as amenable to the mic as I can be. In 1774, Samuel Hopkins of Newport, Rhode Island's First Congregational Church proposed to his religious colleague Ezra Stiles to send John Kwame and Bristol Yama, two free black communicants from his church, to Africa. Kwame and Yama were to be educated at New Jersey College and eventually connect with Kwame's family on the African coast to help negotiate some land for the next wave of settlers. This plan ended with the outbreak of the Revolutionary War and the death of John Kwame, but Hopkins kept his hopes alive throughout the conflict. Furthermore, other free blacks in New England and the Mid-Atlantic states pursued the dream of colonization. In the same month that Samuel Hopkins proposed the African Missionary Project to Stiles, blacks in Massachusetts requested that the colonial legislature emancipate them and their families, hoping to leave the colony. They even planned, quote, from our joint labors to procure money to transport ourselves to some part of the coast of Africa where we proposed a settlement. Even before the Revolutionary War prompted one of the initial waves of black emancipation in the northern states, blacks in the region dreamed of a life in Africa that blended Christianity with independence. In Nova Scotia, free blacks also pursued the possibilities of migrating to Africa. Following the Revolutionary War, approximately 3,000 blacks who had supported the British left the United States for Nova Scotia, believing their service to the British military not only promised them emancipation, but economic independence as well. These loyal black refugees, as they called themselves, discovered that the land appropriated to them, that is, those who were able to receive it, was mostly infertile. A number of these free men and women had to hire themselves or their children out to white employers in order to feed themselves and their families. Compounded by the harsh winter climate, the loyal blacks encountered a challenging economic and social atmosphere. Some, like the black artisan... Slow down? I'm sorry, thank you. Okay, let me find my place here. Some, like the black veteran Boston King, worked as artisans or in the fishing industry. By the 1790s, economic hardship and an increasing climate of racial hostility created discouraging conditions for Nova Scotia's free blacks. When John Clarkson arrived to the colony in 1791 to recruit settlers for the Sierra Leone colony, he was overwhelmed by the response to leave Nova Scotia for Africa. In the end, he could only take about 1,200 black men, women, and children. The story of the loyal blacks in Nova Scotia and Clarkson's mission to recruit colonists illustrates how the promise of emancipation for the colony's free blacks was challenged, and how the prospect of leaving for Africa held the potential to fulfill their dreams of freedom. Now, traditionally, scholars such as James St. George Walker, Sylvia Fry, and Graham Russell Hodges have viewed the African colonization movement in the post-war period, particularly that which emerged in Nova Scotia, as part of a larger story about black freedom struggles in the age of the American Revolution. While the colonization movements in Rhode Island and Nova Scotia are undoubtedly part of that story, recent scholarship on the Black Atlantic raises questions about the more Atlantic dimensions of these movements. Since Paul Gilroy published his seminal book on the Black Atlantic nearly 10 years ago, scholars have looked at the lives of black people such as Ulauda Equiano, Venture Smith, and others who traversed the Atlantic world, describing the ways Western and African culture fused to form a particular black Atlantic identity. As we will see, blacks who pursued emigration to Africa, particularly those in Rhode Island, saw themselves as part of a larger Atlantic community that combined an ethnic identity of blackness with the Western values of liberalism and Christianity. These men and women were experiencing the double consciousness of the Black Atlantic that Gilroy so poignantly describes. They viewed Africa through a Euro-American lens while experiencing the racial legacy of slavery. The stories of the African colonization movements in Rhode Island and Nova Scotia illuminate two dimensions of the Black Atlantic. Firstly, in Rhode Island, movement leaders such as John Kwame and Newport Cardinal reflect the ways Atlantic Creoles played a key role in promoting colonization, and how their Creole identities factored into the ways they envisioned African colonization. Secondly, in Nova Scotia, economic independence, that is, the control of land and labor, factored into the ways free blacks defined freedom, reflecting what Philip Gould has identified as a liberal impulse that blacks internalized as they engaged in the capitalist political economy of the Atlantic world. Together, an examination of the colonization movements that immediately followed the Revolutionary War in Rhode Island and Nova Scotia suggests how Western ideas of race, liberalism, and Christianity fused to define the Black Atlantic identity. Okay, briefly I'm going to talk about the African Union Society and the African colonization movement in Rhode Island. The members of Newport's African Union Society heard proposals for African colonization soon after they formed their organization in 1787. In fact, that year, William Thornton, one proponent of African colonization, was in New England to promote his plan. However, the Union Society members rejected Thornton's plan as they agreed with other black societies who, quote, did not approve of W. Thornton's going to settle a place for us. We think it better if we should charter a vessel and send some of our own blacks, end quote. After receiving a letter from a Massachusetts black organization, Union Society President Anthony Taylor wrote to Thornton describing the Newport African Union Society's intentions. He said that a number of men, quote, among ourselves shall be sent to Africa to see if they can obtain a gift or purchase some of the king's or chief people, lands proper and sufficient to settle upon, end quote. According to Taylor, the Union Society wanted to send a reconnaissance group to prepare for the imminent arrival of American blacks. With Newport Gardner at the helm of the expedition, the African Union Society hoped to lead a colonization effort that would ultimately involve free blacks throughout the North Atlantic states. In letters to the Providence and Philadelphia black organizations, the Newporters hoped to generate enough support from the others to leave the United States. In 1789, Newport's African Union Society solicited information from the Providence Group. Their letter described the motives for colonization, the colonization plan, and hoped that with financial support, quote, we may be able to prosecute this grand design for the welfare of our oppressed brothers and the best interest of our poor suffering nations in Africa, end quote. Unfortunately for the Newport group, the Providence men were mostly not interested in leaving Rhode Island. Furthermore, they were becoming upset with Newport's efforts to direct their affairs. While they had originally solicited ideas about organizing, the Providence Society quickly became embittered with Newport's meddling. For their part, Newporters attempted to allay their concerns by envisioning their project more broadly. In a letter that was sent to other black institutions as well, Newporters described the principles for the immigration enterprise, quote, so that we all may promote one common good, end quote. Besides leading the way for blacks in the United States and the West Indies, the Union Society wanted their settlement to influence the lives of native Africans as well. The letter described, quote, our brethren, the nations in Africa, from whom we spring, quote, as living in heathenish darkness and sunk down in barbarity, end quote, who committed the crime of enslaving one another, quote, by which means many millions have either lost their lives or have been transported to a land of slavery, end quote. Now, the Philadelphia Society was less indifferent than as the Providence Group, but could not offer any support as well. However, their letter reveals how the colonization movement tried to address the issue of social injustice and why they believed, like the Newporters, that colonization offered an answer. More than the Newporters, the Philadelphians viewed colonization as a prophecy from God, and that the Lord, quote, thereby may be pleased to break every yoke and let the oppressed go free, end quote. And with the help of the Lord, quote, swords shall be beat into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, that nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither shall they learn war any more. A happy day this will be to us of the African race, and mankind in general. Then captivity will cease, and the buying and selling of mankind have an end quote. The letter from the Philadelphia Society invoked the same themes as those of the African Union Society. Both organizations believed they could influence black life in the Atlantic world. In effect, they would be conduits of change for African slaves and natives. First, by upholding virtue and industry, they would be leading examples of the African race in North America. And second, through Christianity, they could save the Africans from their quote-unquote barbarity, which they believe contributed to enslavement of fellow Africans. Furthermore, their settlement would organize a new trading system that will rival and hopefully defeat the slave trade. Blacks, such as Paul Kufi, envisioned an African economic diaspora that would connect, quote, the African race, end quote, throughout the Atlantic. Indeed, Kufi intended to establish commercial ties with the black immigrants in Sierra Leone to tap into African and American markets, particularly for ivory, and support the settlements in Africa. After the Revolutionary War, blacks throughout the Atlantic world worked towards a common goal of abolitionism and repatriation to Africa. While influenced by the language of the Revolutionary Age, these movements were not bound by national disputes or boundaries. The connection of American and British abolitionists and the dreams of bringing together blacks from British America, England, and the United States to Africa illustrates the Atlantic nature of black culture and society in the post-war period. Although some historians consider these political and social movements as part of the larger Republican impulse that framed the period of democratic revolutions in America and Europe, the language of racial uplift that guided black abolitionism and colonization appears altogether different and tied to a more black Atlantic sensibility. Now, while their cultural goals of moral righteousness and industry paralleled the language of Republicans like Thomas Paine, their vocabulary was rooted in a more specific religious millennial vision that differentiated their idea of republicanism from Paine or other prominent Republicans like Thomas Jefferson or James Madison, to name a few. Fundamentally, their Christian worldview shaped their black Atlantic political outlook, articulated in a millennial language that envisioned the establishment of a new world in Africa, one that blended their religious worldview with social and political egalitarianism on African soil. Free blacks in Newport and throughout the United States saw their cause in the wider perspective of Christian teleology. Their mission was to implement God's plan to save Africans from themselves and white slaveholders by establishing communities along the African coast. Men like Newport Gardner, Salmar Nubia, and Anthony Taylor did not see themselves merely as Americans, but as Christianized Africans in the African Atlantic world. In the world of European and African encounters, they remained conduits between both communities, hoping to proselytize Christianity to natives while demonstrating to Europeans, European Americans, and Africans that slavery was sinful. In this context, they wanted to show that it was possible to participate in the emerging Atlantic capitalist political economy without slave labor. As we will see with the black loyalists who left Nova Scotia for Sierra Leone, these latter-day Atlantic Creoles believed they could save the Atlantic world by promoting a society based upon free labor. In this capacity, they would illustrate that the libertarian ideals gaining currency among Republicans in Europe and America could manifest on the shores of Africa as well. Okay, now I want to turn to the loyal blacks and their quest for freedom. The lives of black Newporters and Nova Scotians collectively illustrate the ways the conditions of the Revolution enabled these men and women to articulate their ideas of freedom and independence. For both groups, self-sufficiency was the key to freedom. While Graham Russell Hodges has connected the ideas of the loyal blacks with the Republican ethos of the Atlantic world, I find it a bit difficult to reconcile this black republicanism and the absence of a Republican vocabulary among the black Nova Scotians themselves. Still, Hodges correctly notes that the ideas about Republican free labor correspond with the loyal blacks' determination to acquire land to ensure their freedom. Indeed, it was the centrality of land in the black loyalist worldview and its connection to freedom that propelled them to leave Nova Scotia. Now, John Clarkson arrived in Halifax in October 1791, intending to inform the lieutenant governor of his plan and to receive his assistance, hopefully, in soliciting the Sierra Leone Company's offer to the free blacks of the colony. Now, the company's plan was not dissimilar to the proposal originally offered the loyal blacks upon joining the British Army. In fact, under Clarkson's plan, they were offered less land than they could receive in Nova Scotia. However, one significant clause in the plan differed dramatically. The Sierra Leone Company promised, quote, that the civil, military, personal, and commercial rights and duties of blacks and whites shall be the same and secured in the same manner. End quote. Thomas Peters, one of the free blacks leading the colonization movement, had been sent ahead of Clarkson to reveal the plan of the company to blacks in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, with Clarkson hoping to coordinate the logistics of the immigration effort. Upon his arrival, what Clarkson found challenged his previous impressions about the state of Nova Scotia's black veterans. In first traveling to Preston, Clarkson discovered that the free blacks lived in very poor conditions. In his diary, he noted that, quote, their situation seemed extremely bad from the poorness of the soil and from their having nothing to subsist upon but the produce of it, end quote. What he witnessed in Preston epitomized the state of rural blacks throughout the colony. Shortly after his arrival, Clarkson determined to visit Shelburne and Birchtown and was overwhelmed by the eagerness of the freedmen and women to leave Nova Scotia for Sierra Leone. Even before he left Halifax Harbor, 79 free blacks from the seaport and Preston committed themselves to going to Africa. After registering them, he concluded, quote, by the account given in by many of the free blacks who gave their names in this morning, there cannot be a doubt but their complaints were founded on facts, for they have certainly been much oppressed and are now in a deplorable state, end quote. When Clarkson arrived in Shelburne, he encountered a receptive black audience and a disgruntled white population. White Nova Scotians inhibited Clarkson's plan the moment he stepped off the ship in Halifax. When he asked Lieutenant Governor Parr to advertise a bulletin about the Sierra Leone Company, Parr called the colony Guinea, thereby suggesting slavery and the slave trade, according to Clarkson. Although Clarkson asked him to replace Guinea with Africa, rumors had already spread about the difficulties the free blacks from England had encountered in Sierra Leone. White Nova Scotians reported that King Jemmy of Africa had driven the colonists from their settlement and slaughtered the majority of them. Despite tense race relations, many white Nova Scotians wanted the blacks to remain in the colony to serve their labor needs. As Clarkson noted, quote, The principal inhabitants and white people of this neighborhood were averse to any plan that tended to deprive them of the assistance of the blacks in the cultivation of their lands, well knowing that people of their own color, i.e. white people, would never engage with them without being paid equitable price for their labor, end quote. White inhabitants even spread stories that the loyal black refugees would be renters in Sierra Leone instead of remaining free yeomen in Nova Scotia. Frustrated with the prospects of immigration, white Nova Scotians even threatened to refuse certificates of good character to further inhibit blacks from leaving Nova Scotia. When the popular black preacher David George heard Clarkson had arrived in Shelburne, he immediately met him, describing how, quote, his companions in the most abject state of servitude, and that if it were known in the town that he had conversed with us in private, his life would not be safe, end quote. George further warned Clarkson and his companion not to appear in public after dark, since, quote, some of the inhabitants plan to do us injury, end quote, according to Clarkson. The threats of white Nova Scotians notwithstanding, blacks in Birchtown and Shelburne registered to go to Halifax and embark for Sierra Leone. Indeed, the numbers Clarkson encountered forced him to reconsider his logistical plans. Anticipating leaving within a year, he had encouraged them to keep only what they would need while waiting to depart. But now Clarkson worried that they would have an extended stay in Halifax until enough ships arrived to take them to the African coast. The response from free blacks in the region overwhelmed him. Even after he explained the challenge they would face, they assured him, quote, they were unanimous in their desire for embarking for Africa, telling their labor was lost upon this land in this country, that being now sunk to the lowest pitch of wretchedness, their condition could not otherwise then be ameliorated, end quote. The applicants were willing to take a chance on the mission, even though, quote, disease and even death were the consequence, end quote. According to Clarkson, most wanted to emigrate in order to provide their children with better prospects rather than improve their personal conditions. Like families throughout British America, these men and women wanted property to defend their children from falling into dependent relations. In November and December 1791, John Clarkson planned the voyage to Sierra Leone. He awaited word from Thomas Peters, who was gathering people in Annapolis County and New Brunswick. Day by day, free blacks from Nova Scotia arrived upon Halifax, hoping to leave the colony for Africa. Clarkson was inundated with petitions from freedmen and women and prayed that he could assist all of them. Some of these petitions, like those from two groups in Preston, requested that Clarkson protect the communities that they had built over the previous 7 years. One petition, written by Richard Williams, stated, quote, that your petitioners hath lived with neighbors in the township of Preston between 6 and 7 years, and are all united together, and are all well acquainted with each other, and our petition is that we be pleased to settle us all together on our lands in Sierra Leone without being intermixed with strangers, end quote. Now, this particular petition was difficult for Clarkson to honor, because he respected the Preston blacks so much that he wanted to integrate the people from the Preston settlement with others so that the latter could model their work habits after the Preston blacks. The other Preston petition asked if the Preston Baptists could elect the teachers and ministers of their settlement themselves. Written by Hector Peters, the Baptist minister whom David George left in charge of the black congregation in Preston, the signed petition was unlike many of those by the quote-unquote free Ethiopians who served in His Majesty's service. Peters and other petitioners requested the right of self-governance. Like previous memorial, though, it represents a growing awareness of community and the desire to protect embryonic social ties. In the post-war period, free blacks were forging social and cultural bonds with one another, and the economic and social distress of the period solidified those bonds. The Preston petitioners wanted to ensure the protection of these relations, making sure that they would be intact as they ventured into yet another new experience. They had learned that these ties were important in post-war Nova Scotia, and they knew they could be valuable as they settled again in Sierra Leone. Now, after Thomas Peters arrived with the freedmen and their families, the enlisted colonists prepared to set sail for Sierra Leone in January of the following year, that is 1792. While they would encounter major challenges and the colony would ultimately fail in its original aspirations, the free blacks still established a settlement that implemented the social and cultural goals that they had developed since they joined the British Army during the Revolutionary War. The veterans of the Revolutionary War fought for social and political freedom. They knew that emancipation would not protect them from economic dependency and wanted sizable and fertile land upon which to subsist. While a sizable number of these veterans were artisans, they nonetheless sought lives as yeomen as they linked independence to laboring the land. They chose life as farmers despite their training because for them ownership of land symbolized freedom. Yet the land they were given in Nova Scotia, if they were given any at all, was difficult to toil, and they found themselves unable to produce enough food to subsist. Some chose to indenture themselves or their family members to survive, entering into the type of dependent relationship they left behind in America. Still, they harbored hopes that this was only temporary, and when Thomas Peters and John Clarkson arrived with a colonization plan, many of them were willing to take their risks were willing to take the risk in order to live as independent people in Africa. As this paper has argued, the post-revolutionary African colonization movements emerged in a particular socio-historical context in Rhode Island and Nova Scotia, but ones that collectively imagined a better life for blacks in Africa. In Rhode Island, Atlantic Creoles such as John Quamine and Newport Gardner, men who had been born in Africa, who had been brought to Rhode Island as slaves and acculturated to Anglo-American culture, were involved as leaders in the plans to colonize Africa. I do not want to overstate the importance of the involvement of the Atlantic Creoles in the colonization movement, because it is difficult to get sufficient data on all the members who were engaged in the efforts to emigrate to Africa. But nonetheless, their leadership roles in the Rhode Island colonization movement require us to consider the degree to which the post-revolutionary colonization movements reflected the larger culture of Atlantic Creolism that historically defined the Black Atlantic littoral. Men like Quamine and Gardner were chosen as leaders because they embodied the fusion of Western and African cultures and had the social and cultural skills that would allow them to mediate between Anglo-American and African societies, which, as Ira Berlin has argued, Atlantic Creoles were doing for nearly 3 centuries throughout the Atlantic littoral. Now, blacks in Nova Scotia reflected a different thread of the Black Atlantic identity. As American-born blacks, they were tied to the racial legacy of slavery and the emancipation movements produced by the American Revolution. Their participation in the Revolutionary War inspired dreams of liberty and independence, demonstrating how they had internalized the larger libertarian ethos of the economic and political independence that defined the Revolutionary age. When they encountered racial hostility and discrimination in Nova Scotia, nearly half of them pursued the opportunity to immigrate to Africa in order to live a life of freedom. We must be careful, though, not to romanticize the Sierra Leone colony, for its settlers encountered extreme hardships, and the colony in the early settlement period endured more failures than successes. Still, we need to remember the hopes and dreams of its early advocates, and how settlers imagined what Sierra Leone could be. Once in Sierra Leone, men like David George continued to evangelize Christianity and sought to live lives as yeoman farmers or artisans. As political and economic agents, these men and women embodied the emerging ethos of modernity that defined the Atlantic world in the Revolutionary Age. The African colonization movements surrounding the initial settlement of Sierra Leone in the post-revolutionary period then represent a particular moment in the history of the Black Atlantic and could arguably be considered the apotheosis of the intense cultural exchange that defined the 18th century Atlantic world. Atlantic colonies But as the 19th century dawned, England became less engaged in its Atlantic colonies and directed its colonial project towards Africa and Asia. The United States, too, directed its economic and political expansion in a different direction as it proceeded to expand its nation westward. Moreover, blacks in the United States and Nova Scotia increasingly viewed colonization movements with suspicion and, in some cases, hostility. Much like whites, they began to see themselves within the paradigm of modern nationalism. For the generations of blacks who came of age in the 19th century, the black Atlantic became less a node of political, cultural, and social exchange, and more a mythic and ethnic ideal for a relative few. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Get synchronized here. Okay, I'll just launch into this. Since 1807, a free black man by the name of William Lanson had been actively involved in the construction of the first half of New Haven's new wharf. The remaining 1,350 feet, which would connect the wharf with the pier farther out in the harbor, was unusually challenging to construct, for the bottom was very soft mud, and by 1810, all efforts to build on it had failed. After several other contractors had abandoned it, Lanson engaged to finish the wharf extension, in part to show what a black man was capable of doing, as one white raconteur recalled later in the century. Working relentlessly even on the darkest nights, Lanson finished this vital civic project, which had eluded all others. As a New Haven chronicler asserted later in the 19th century, Lanson, quote, was respected as a man of energy and skill, and was a useful citizen. He was capable of great things, unquote. Indeed, William Lanson was. Lanson moved to New Haven about 1803, and within the short space of 7 years, he was a property owner, an enfranchised freeholder, and an emerging local entrepreneur. Over the ensuing years, Lanson would expand his wharfing and quarrying business, establish one of the leading hostleries in New Haven, and purchase substantial acreage and houses in New Haven's largely undeveloped new township, an area immediately to the east of the town's original 9 squares, the core of the original New Haven settlement. At a time when the majority of local free adult blacks had only lived outside of slavery for a matter of years, when economic and civic opportunity for them was minimal at best, and when the assumption of black irresponsibility under freedom was common, Lanson conducted himself as though such barriers did not apply to him. In 1811, the Reverend Timothy Dwight, president of Yale College, praised the work of William and his brothers on Long Wharf for affording, quote, honorable proof of the character which they sustained, both for capacity and integrity in the view of respectable men, unquote. By the early 1820s, Lanson was deeply embedded in the civic and economic life of New Haven, lauded for his character, depended upon for his skills, and heralded as the future promise of their race. Yet by 1830, all of this was rapidly becoming unraveled. Lanson was beginning to lose some of his property. He suffered significant financial losses in his wharfing and livery businesses. And increasingly, he was pilloried publicly for sustaining houses of ill repute in the new township. Lanson's new township properties, which by 1830 had become a problem, were envisioned initially, as he was accumulating them in the early 1810s, as a neighborhood in which to settle a portion of the scattered and problematic freed people emerging from slavery. After 1825, however, all was transformed. A growing New Haven began to develop the western portion of the new township for residences and for manufacturing. The launching of the Farmington Canal in 1825 led to a dramatic influx of poor and Catholic Irish laborers into the town. And the popular white mood, fueled by the rise of the American Colonization Society over the preceding years, was decidedly veering towards notions of fundamental black degradation and inassimilability. Combined with persisting poverty and other problems for many local African Americans, which seemed only to confirm their inferiority, white New Haven of 1830 determined to scourge the former man of capacity and integrity as the pestilent vice king who had to be removed and quarantined. William Lanson and his remarkable course in early 19th century New Haven afford us a view into the complicated, paradoxical, and painful dynamics of African Americans becoming free in the early antebellum North. It is no surprise that Timothy Dwight and others of like mind were observing and evaluating William Lanson very closely. As key members of the Connecticut Society for the Promotion of Freedom and the Relief of Persons Not Done Yet, unlawfully holden in bondage, founded in 1791, Dwight, his brother Theodore, Noah Webster, Simeon Baldwin, Jonathan Edwards Jr., and a number of other local white notables played an instrumental role in advancing gradual emancipation in Connecticut in the late 18th century and arguing for the capacity of the freed people to improve themselves. Yet they also viewed the freed people very problematically. Timothy Dwight's brief praise of the Lansons above is actually embedded in a much lengthier, disdainful treatment of black New Haveners' culture and prospects, summarized best in the following statement: their vices are of all kinds, uneducated to principles of morality or to habits of industry and economy. They labor only to acquire the means of expense and expend only to gratify gross and vulgar appetite, unquote. Freedom for the slaves was a good, but Dwight and others also believed their enslavement had affected them deleteriously and that damage could only be redressed over time. According to these conservative white reformers, freedom without a simultaneous commitment to uplift the ex-slaves and supervise them would prove worse for all than leaving them in slavery. It was thus imperative that they assist African Americans to acculturate immediately to responsible self-regulation. For example, in 1796, they posted on the front page of the Connecticut Journal a lengthy article to the state's free Africans highlighting 9 guidelines for their moral improvement, including education, worship, regular employment, temperance, simple, non-ostentatious demeanor, and frequent reading of the Bible, which contains, as they said, the precious word of the original equality of mankind and the obligations of universal justice and benevolence, which are derived from the relation of the human race to each other in a common Father, unquote. If the freed slaves could be brought to embrace these guidelines, then their supposed impulse to turbulence and irresponsibility might be restrained during this transition from slavery to freedom. And as the general white populace became more secure with black emancipation, the freedmen would be endowed over time with more of the rights and duties of citizenship. This thinking persisted into the 19th century and crystallized into a compelling vision of racial fellowship and charity, articulated best by Timothy Dwight. Deeply influenced by the Calvinist New Divinity theology of Samuel Hopkins and its core doctrine of disinterested benevolence, Dwight pronounced a sermon in New Haven in 1810 that would reassert the New Divinity vision of the quintessential sinfulness of slavery and of the guilty community's obligation to emancipate, uplift, and embrace the formerly enslaved in Christian fellowship. Applauding the influence of the overwhelming conviction, unquote, which had led the state to move towards ending slavery, he, however, wondered if we have actually done any service. Dwight actually wondered if we'd done any service for African Americans, as they are now free only to become, quote, miserable victims to sloth, prodigality, poverty, ignorance, and vice, unquote. Dwight then reaffirmed the profound obligation contemporary New Haven had accrued to its black residents. And I quote, "When we introduced these unhappy people into this country, we charged ourselves with the whole care of their temporal and eternal interests, and became responsible for the manner in which we should perform this duty. It is in vain to allege that our ancestors brought them hither and not we. As well might a son who inherited an ample patrimony refuse to pay a debt because it was contracted by his father. We inherit our ample patrimony with all its encumbrances and are bound to pay the debts of our ancestors. This debt, particularly, we are bound to discharge. To give them liberty and stop here, them being African Americans, and stop here, is to entail upon them a curse. We are bound to give them also knowledge, industry, economy, good habits, moral and religious instruction, and all the means of eternal life. The performance of this duty will make them blessings. The neglect of it will make them curses to society. Dwight, in fact, largely held blacks blameless for their perceived moral foibles. We complain of their vice. Who in such circumstances would not be vicious? The ultimate responsibility for their reformation lay with the broader white community, who are bound to give them, as he said, the morality and tools of right living, of which they and their ancestors had deprived them under slavery. Along with the impact of the benevolent outreach of whites to blacks, Dwight was certain also of the morally sanative benefits of property ownership. In his 1811 statistical report about the state of New Haven, Dwight heralded that, quote, almost all African Americans who acquire an attachment to property appear to assume better principles, or at least better practices. Several of the men have, in this manner, become good members of society, and that's a reference to the Lansons, to Lanson. Between April 1807 and February 1824, William Lanson, and on occasion with his brothers Abel and Laban, made at least 13 purchases of land in the largely undeveloped and inexpensive new township. Steadily adding contiguous acreage and houses, Lanson rented space to a growing number of African Americans who found renting elsewhere in the city difficult. His holdings in this small community, soon designated New Guinea, would only grow over the course of the 1810s and 1820s. Lanson soon would further service it by opening a grocery, which sold food and various sundries, including liquor, a commodity sold near universally and commonly without licenses at such establishments. Black New Township residents also provided Lanson with an ample pool of laborers for his burgeoning enterprises. Throughout the 1810s and 1820s, Lanson's quarrying and wharfing business remained lively, and he required many laborers. Even amid his financial reversals of the late 1820s, he could still, as he said, keep 20 or 30 in constant employ. While not necessarily directly intervening in the creation of this new black neighborhood, white New Haven in many ways benefited from it. The creation of a black neighborhood under the auspices of a respectable black businessman who offered a clear example of black industry and morality, along with plenty of employment, might well be seen by white New Haven as a significant antidote to a perceived African predilection to sloth and degradation. Moreover, it concentrated a number of blacks emerging from white households in a marginal corner of the town and kept them from locating in the core where they were more visible and unwanted. While Lanson would have had the credit to purchase land elsewhere in New Haven, including within the 9 squares, his purchases were exclusively within the relatively marginal area of the new township. Despite Dwight's bold and progressive pronouncements about race in 1810, the reality remained that whites, in fact, would do relatively little to assist and guide blacks as slavery was ending in the state. If uplift of whatever sort were to be offered, it would commonly have to be delivered largely by blacks themselves. Lanson's success as a businessman was directly related to the network of relationships with influential men who were the acme of the local Congregational Federalist elite. Men such as Simeon Baldwin, Seth Staples, and Roger Sherman Baldwin, and the large local maritime merchant John Heaton. The Union Wharf Company, which was responsible for Long Wharf development, and was replete with old elite figures such as Simeon Baldwin, William Leffingwell, Caleb Brentnall, Roger Sherman, Nathaniel Clark, and others, I won't go on, continued to contract extensively with Lanson for work on the wharf and in the harbor into the 1830s. Their willingness to contract with him was founded largely on his reputation for effective industry and responsible property ownership. He delivered. The products he contracted for with them, he always delivered on them within the amount of time required and at or below cost. Between 1810 and 1820, the free black population of New Haven increased dramatically from 389 to 624. 624 is probably roughly, in terms of New Haven itself, probably roughly about 8 or 9% of the total town population. According to a rough sampling of the 1820 federal census, at least 141 of these African Americans were living in the new township neighborhood. The actual number is almost certainly higher, for many blacks were missed in census countings, especially those who were fugitives, of whom there were a growing number in New Haven and the new township. By 1820, as local white support for the American Colonization Society was growing, one citizen noted the surprising growth of the free blacks on the outskirts of the city, while another later one warned that fugitives and southern free blacks come northward and are rapidly increasing in this town. In 1823, another commentator estimated that the city now contained about 700 free blacks, and that measures must be taken to regulate this unhappy people who were degraded in a degree scarcely removed from that of an irrational creature. Sounds like Hades burning brightly just on the other side of the 9 squares. Yet well into the 1820s, the black new township neighborhood received at the most only incidental attention, and William Lanson's enterprises and properties continued to thrive, and his positive reputation remained secure well into the 1820s. Indeed, in 1824, Lanson was one of the principals in the creation of the first specifically black religious congregation in New Haven, the African United Ecclesiastical Society. Long sought by a local white reformer, the Reverend Simeon Jocelyn, the Union Society's board, however, was exclusively black, and along with Lanson included several other notable members of the black community. Its express objective was, quote, improving the morals, promoting the piety, and increasing the religious knowledge of that part, i.e. African American, of the population, unquote. Lanson was instrumental in purchasing the plot of land in the town center, which became the seat of the new Union Society. In 1826, the principals of the Union Society joined with white supporters Reverend Leonard Bacon and Jocelyn to launch the African Improvement Society for the improvement, as they said, of the moral, intellectual, and religious condition of the African population of the city. The African Ecclesiastical Society's church quickly became a center for black assemblage and celebrations in New Haven. On July 5th, 1827, New Haven celebrated the abolition of slavery in New York in unison with blacks in that state. All public, when this event was, all the public exercises around this celebration were held at the African Church on July 5th, 1827. In 1827, an African assumed for the first time an official public presence in the very center of New Haven. Let me do that again. In 1827, as African Americans assumed for the first time an official public presence in the very center of New Haven, that is, at this new Union Ecclesiastical Church that was very near the Green, as they were assuming this new public position in the center of the town, William Lanson sat at the forefront of this great accomplishment for moral advance and racial fellowship in New Haven. Such an elevation only rendered that much more dramatic the precipitous public decline William Lanson simultaneously commenced. New Haven of the late 1820s had changed enormously from the compact, rather insular town it was in 1810. One of the most important harbingers of fundamental change in New Haven was the electoral defeat of the old Federalist Congregational elite, commonly referred to as the Standing Order. in 1817 by a combination of Democratic Republicans and denominations dissenting from the state-supported Congregational Church. This political turnover led in 1818 to the rewriting of Connecticut's Constitution and disfranchising black voters while enfranchising all adult white males. It would also lead to the rise of new political leaders who felt no debt or paternalistic obligation, however vague, to New Haven's African Americans. The decade of the 1820s was one of enormous demographic and economic change for New Haven. Despite the embargoes of Jefferson's second administration, the War of 1812, and the Panic of 1819, New Haven by 1820 had enhanced itself as a regional port, fostered the growth of manufacturing and the banking to support it, and established solid relations with merchants in New York City with much broader commercial connections. By 1820, with the enormous commercial success of the opening of the Erie Canal in New York, canal fever struck in New Haven as visions of readier access to producers in central and north central Connecticut joined with hopes of gaining new ones in Massachusetts and beyond. The town's leading merchants and manufacturers were confident that the canal would lead to New Haven becoming the port of southern New England, and to a dramatic growth in their wealth and economic influence. At the same time as the canal was to be cut along the eastern boundary of the original 9 squares, the new post-1817 city government also looked to the Long Wharf area and to the new township for new residential and commercial space. Between 1820 and 1830, town population grew 44%, its total population, from roughly 7,600 to 11,000. With expanding economic horizons and new demands for space in which to grow, the city fathers enthusiastically turned to the largely undeveloped lands of the new township. By the end of 1825, investors were profiting from the sale of increasingly lucrative property in the area's newly planned Worcester Square, Worcester Square was planned in the heart of the new township district, and 2 new dramatic mansions were already under construction there, one just less than a block from William Lanson's New Guinea. William Lanson and his new township properties only began to become problematic in the public eye after 1825, as the city underwent these economic and demographic transformations. By late 1828, a lengthy report neatly summarized the new emphasis on vice in the neighborhood, and I quote, "Vice centers chiefly at a few houses in New Township. It exhibits here an almost uninterrupted scene of drunkenness, profanation, and brawling," unquote. One outraged resident in mid-1828 reinforced the urgency. "Let the virtuous inhabitants of the new township unite and purge this beautiful and rapidly improving section of our city from these defilements," unquote. These defilements were closely associated with William Lanson by the late 1820s. While drunkenness, profaneness, and brawling were always front and center in the complaints lodged against his residences, of even more fundamental concern to one of his detractors was that such profligacy occurred among interracial groups, that, quote, "black people and white were all under one roof, and I think it's almost equal to Sodom, and I mean to have it broken up," stated one concerned resident. From the mid-1820s, New Haven provided a notable increase in opportunities for such interracial cavorting. The principal laborers on the Farmington Canal between New Haven and Farmington were poor Irish navvies. Many of them recruited from the recently completed Erie Canal in upstate New York. The censuses from 1820 and 1830 reveal that the increase of men between the age of 16 and 44, the group in which virtually all of the navvies would fall, was dramatic. Between 1820 and 1830, the numbers in that age bracket grew from roughly 1,700 to 2,900, an increase of approximately 70%. Very large. Women in that age bracket increased as well over the decade, from 1,770 to roughly 2,400, an increase of about 35%. While the Irish did not constitute all of this increase, they probably comprised one of the most important stratums of it. While contractors liked their cheap labor, the newly arriving Irish were viewed with deep suspicion by the mass of New Haven natives who disdained their Catholicism and readily embraced Anglo-American Protestant stereotypes of Irish drunkenness, ignorance, and savagery. Many of them resided and socialized in the 1820s in a section of the new township called Slineyville, which was immediately adjacent to Lanson's properties into Worcester Square and obviously helped occasion the mixing of both black and white. Moreover, a report in 1829 emphasized that many young men and women from the country were now coming into New Haven, quote, to seek society or employment, and in their ignorance of the world are in danger of being drawn into the sink of iniquity, unquote. Once there, they, quote, perhaps become partakers of its wickedness. Well aware of the growing number of such transients entering the prospering town, reformers and officials feared for their prospects because they commonly could not find lodging in places other than neighborhoods such as Slineyville or New Guinea. The growing numbers of mariners who visited the port of New Haven in the 1820s further swelled the number of transient whites and blacks. One worried native observed in 1828 that there will be between 300 and 500 seamen along the docks on Sunday. Should this part of society be ignored? Nervous local merchants, officials, and reformers thus formed the Seamen's Friend and Marine Bible Society late in the 1820s, not only to promote observance of the Sabbath, but to prevent the mariners' infamous predilection for drinking and carousing. However, strive as they might, they could not prevent them from finding their way to Lanson's neighborhood, where they would, as Lanson recalled with some affection, get all their shipmates together, and then they fiddle and dance, and there they will sing their hoisting sailor songs, so that it may be heard 1 mile, unquote. Afterwards, as he said, some of the colored people's white shipmates might come to my place for supper and socializing. Lanson found nothing reprehensible about white and black interacting in his neighborhood, although he acknowledged that such engagements sometimes led to rowdiness. Lanson refused to understand his neighborhood as fundamentally corrupt. He never mentioned removal of the community as an option. Lanson looked for sources of any necessary renewal within the black community itself, where he described a much more complicated social structure and surprising sources of strength, which largely eluded white reformers. After acknowledging complaints against some of his tenants with some sarcasm, oh, bad, bad, as he said, he observed that there were some second and third classes of people of color in some of the houses, but by no means did they represent all in his dwellings. In an 1829 newspaper announcement, Lanson wrote, I consider that there are some families in that street as smart and industrious people of color as any in town. Why I style those people above mentioned to belong to the lower classes is on account of their slothful manner of living and the awful disadvantages of being brought up in ignorance. These are mostly transient people, bred in ignorance, until they came or ran away from their bondage. Here, there may be a great number of them together, here in the new township, and how do they live? By working alongshore, sawing wood, going to sea, and at other jobs. If they fiddled and danced and sang and got a little too loud at night, Lanson stopped them, and they apologetically complied. But he did not find this behavior hopelessly degraded, but rather described their simple amusements, quote, as their mode of pleasure, and therefore I excuse them as much as possible. He added further, whenever this class of people get into any quarrel that comes to my knowledge, I can stop it very quick. And I tell them once or twice a month, if they are found to steal the value of 1 shilling, I would have them reported. And more than this, I offer a small bounty to those that I call the honest ones to catch the others. He upheld the residents as generally smart and industrious, and he made sure to identify the simple but demanding and useful labors they regularly performed. These were not dangerous people. And he did not shy from indicating his relative closeness to them and his empathy for them and their not undignified struggles. On another occasion, he noted that if sailors attempted, quote, to hide or run away from their employers after having shipped and taken their advance money, I would do all I could in favor of their employers to return them. Lanson was respected in his community, and he actually exercised moral influence over his neighbors. Felt some obligation to orient them towards constructive and upright lives to the extent that they needed it, while serving broader civic interests. He appears actually to have been a sort of benevolent custodian of Black New Township and did not view its residents as meriting stringent moral condemnation. Yet, in the context of race, immigration, and economic growth in early antebellum New Haven, such a perspective was frankly untenable. The rise of organized reform societies in New Haven in the 1820s sharpened the popular understanding of New Guinea as degraded and vice-ridden by highlighting the drunkenness and poverty which apparently pervaded the neighborhood. Civic attention in the 1820s became more focused on the cost of maintaining the growing numbers of poor in the city. By 1823, the town council banned poor relief outside of the almshouse and created a work farm for the poor where all relief costs were met by the labor of the indigent themselves. Central to this innovation was the identification of drunkenness as the root cause of poverty, indolence, broken families, and most other social ills. As the New Society for the Prevention of Pauperism declared in 1822, not a solitary instance exists where intemperance has not been the immediate or remote cause of their poverty and wretchedness. This recognition fueled the emergence in New Haven by 1830 of no less than 4 temperance societies dedicated to espousing the virtues of abstinence and the grim toll of a life in grog shops, the, quote, refuge for vicious young men and women, white and black, unquote. But African Americans were designated an especial threat. The vigorous attack on the intemperate and impoverished by the mid-1820s allied neatly with the aggressive assault on black character waged by the American Colonization Society to condemn the whole of New Haven's black community. By 1818, an auxiliary of the ACS, that's the Colonization Society, was organized in New Haven by some of the leading figures of the collapsing Standing Order. Jeremiah Day, Simeon Baldwin, Ananias Munson, and David Daggett, all former members of the Connecticut Abolition Society, who now enthusiastically promoted the ACS plan for the removal of the nation's free blacks to Liberia. The most vocal proponent of colonizationism in New Haven, however, was the Reverend Leonard Bacon, who in 1823 was appointed pastor of the First Congregational Church, and by the mid-1820s had become one of the nation's most articulate spokesmen for the ACS. His understanding of the condition of and prospects for free blacks in New England was pointed and frank. Are there not thousands of blacks in New England? And do they add anything to the good order and happiness of society? Or rather, are they not, and must they not continue to be, as a body, ignorant and vicious? Adding more to the poor rates of the parishes in which they reside than they do to the income of the government. Although a supporter of the United African Ecclesiastical Society and the African Improvement Society, Bacon was certain that these measures would finally do little to address the fundamental problem posed by the presence of free blacks in American society. What other scheme than colonization, then, for the improvement of the blacks is there before the public? What other efforts are we exhorted to make? What other projects do we hear of? There are a few Sunday schools established for their benefit in our large towns, some right in New Haven. And in some of our cities, the Africans have churches of their own and tolerably well-qualified ministers of their own. But efforts of this kind, taken by themselves, hardly amount to anything. They do not in the least affect the essence of the evil. Rather, his assessment of the condition and capacities of African Americans in America was stark and stern. There are in the United States 238,000 blacks denominated free, but whose freedom confers on them no privilege but the privilege of being more vicious and miserable than slaves can be. Their condition may be repeated in 2 words: irremediable degradation. unquote. Thus, by the late 1820s, the particular association of New Haven's blacks with poverty, drunkenness, and indolence, which had been more formally asserted by the rise of local reform societies in the decade, was made vastly more comprehensive and vigorous by Bacon's and the ACS's identification of them as a people, a race, by nature, bred in irremediable degradation. The two melded to forge an ideological amalgam designating African Americans among numerous problematic races as a people uniquely degraded and uniquely unreceptive to improvement. While Timothy Dwight in the early 1810s at least identified local blacks in whom the promise of a broader black improvement seemed to reside, and bespoke a policy of racial charity and fellowship which might enable this extension, the inheritor of his moral mantle in New Haven made no such concession. Gone was the heralding of even a cadre of upright and industrious African Americans, as all became contained in the bin of degradation. Thus, as the rapid and lucrative development of the new township urged the extirpation of New Guinea, a new and more organized racial ideology reinforced and sanctioned the civic and moral propriety of its removal. The mixing of local blacks with Irish navvies and white mariners, two groups themselves heavily associated in the popular native mind with social ills, was highlighted as particularly inflammatory and counterproductive in a town already pressed to adapt to these new and problematic residents and transients on whom their growing prosperity relied. Over the ensuing years, new residences and tenements would be built in the side streets and lanes of the new township for white artisans and laborers as more and more manufacturing establishments located in the district between 1825 and 1840. But opportunities in this economic and technological advance for New Haven were for white men only. Indeed, as more Irish and other laborers arrived over the years after 1825, they successfully displaced blacks not only from menial and service labor they commonly performed, but even as well from the few enterprises in which they had a niche, such as coach driving and hostling. Hostling is stables, the maintenance of stables for the housing of local people's horses. Hostlers also regularly had gigs and coaches and chaises and things like that to let out. By 1830, the days of Lanson and New Guinea were over. As one white chronicler who had witnessed his turnover as a young man wrote circumspectly, William Lanson was induced to dispose of his real estate interests on Franklin Street, one of the streets very near Worcester Square. In March 1830, Lanson purchased land and the antiquated slaughterhouse upon it in the northeast corner of the new township and relocated there with his stigmatized and marginalized enclave. Dubbed the Liberian Hotel, that's an interesting story in and of itself, but I don't have the time to tell it. This, as he said, boarding house for the people of color where the best of order shall be kept, was repeatedly assaulted by white mobs over the following years until 1842, when it was burned and leveled once and for all. There's much more to this story, but I don't have the time for it. For African Americans in New Haven, 1830 was not 1810. No longer was black entrepreneurialism upheld. No black in New Haven in the late 1820s was remarked as making an important civic contribution, even though Lanson's skills as a quarryman, wharfer, and hostler would be relied upon well into the 1830s. By 1830, Lanson's business intentions were skewed as dedicated solely to vice. Black man with such holdings in 1830 was not deemed to have nearly the social integrity or utility that he was in 1810. By 1830, deepening assumptions about the United States as a white man's country made it all the easier to direct contempt, violence, and exclusion at these people already highly vulnerable. Changing racial attitudes in antebellum America were closely connected to the growth of urban industry and the ensuing influx of a European working class who almost completely pushed blacks aside for employment. While David Roediger, Noel Ignatieff, and others have emphasized the usefulness of the antebellum black presence in deflecting the attention of white laborers from class while facilitating the assimilation of European immigrants around a new definition based on their not being black, the dramatic growth of European immigration and of the white working class from the 1820s onward, frankly, made a black labor force and any black entrepreneurialism less and less necessary in the North. Responding to fears that the local black population had doubled since 1820, Aristides wrote in a New Haven paper in April 1828, "The white natives of New Haven have a right to be employed as laborers in every department of business to the exclusion of those who are black. And if the business of the city increases so as to afford employment for more laborers, white men have a right to come from abroad, and black men have no right. Therefore, if we take any measures which are calculated to elevate the character of our colored people and to make them more industrious and virtuous and enterprising, we are guilty of injustice towards white men who have an exclusive right to be employed. Dynamic urban economies, ample of socially problematic streams of white labor, and an attendant refinement of the ideology of white superiority amalgamated very effectively in the antebellum North to render African Americans more and more marginal. And this had everything to do with the vagaries of William Lanson in black New Haven in the first decades of the 19th century. Thank you.
As suggested by the two papers we have just heard, a number of our contemporaries are re-examining African American culture and black and white race relations in the decades between the end of the War of Independence and the commencement of the organized abolitionist movement. These years are now known as the early Republic, or even more sweepingly, as in Gordon Wood's radicalism of the American Revolution, the Revolutionary Era itself. I would like to begin my commentary by asking three questions for African American studies. 1, what do we see in these years? 2, how do we see it? And 3, why do we see it? For the what, scholars writing on the early Republic now see a recalibration of North American race relations, generally from a 21st century perspective, for the worse, but I would say not without some positive adaptations, particularly those made by African Americans. Even as slavery faded in the North, blacks became less welcome in public places and in public efforts, as well as more likely to receive hostile treatment. In documents that record the thoughts of whites about blacks, we see in these years more and more an idea that blacks are not truly part of American society and should thus be denied its benefits. Peter Hanks has just talked about the view of Lanson as vice-ridden and promoting vice in the 1820s. I did part of my own work on the island of Nantucket and was happy to see a couple of comrades from Nantucket here when I arrived. And very clearly in Nantucket newspapers, which I used, we see a deepening, darkening, less pleasant view of black people in the early Republic. Nantucket had its own secession crisis in the Revolutionary period and actually claimed to be the nation of Nantucket as it as it accepted its role in American society as part of the USA. It joined in with the declining quality of race relations, and we can chart this in the newspapers. One idea also that comes to mind right now, following up on something Peter Hanks said, is the use of the word blood. In 18th century discourse about race, blood was almost always used to refer to the Acts of the Apostles, in which God made humankind all of one blood. And this was used as an abolitionist argument. By 1820s, 1830 or so, there was the idea of a white blood and black blood, and people were making arguments that black people have different blood from white people. And so then, in the course of a few decades, one word symbolizes this transformation. And we could look at many, many other evidences of this trend. This trend undid what many of us see as a more fluid view of race relations, often expressed in the second half of the 18th century. I hesitate to describe this fluidity as remarkable, since it is known to scholars working with the subject, but perhaps in the larger story of 400 years of North American race relations, it is in fact remarkable. The American Colonization Society, founded on January 1st, 1817, institutionalized this trend, this downward decline, and publicized widely in the USA as well as in England the notion of blacks as permanently alien in the USA. In the view of the ACS, blacks were always unwelcome in white society. Its goal, of course, was the geographical separation of whites and blacks. In other words, first send free blacks to Africa or to the West Indies, and ultimately, as slaves were manumitted, send all blacks and create a kind of geographical separation between whites and blacks. This made no sense in several ways. First, it was sometimes hard to tell who was white and who was black. Second, there was no money to fund the emigration. Third, by early 19th century standards of travel, Liberia was not very far away anyway, so the distance was not all that great. But it succeeded, I think, in promoting, establishing its goal of a kind of cultural and civic separation of black people, even as it failed in its goal of the geographic separation of black people. And many people writing today, people like Joanne Mellish, who spoke last night, James Brewer Stewart, I myself have been arguing that 19th and 20th century race relations really stem at least as much from the colonization movement as from slavery itself. If we see positive adaptations on the part of blacks to this perilous situation, they must surely include the formation of black churches and denominations, in other words, separate black churches and separate black denominations, as well as black organizations and black newspapers. For the how of what we see, several factors come to mind. One is the recovery and rereading of black author documents written between 1760 and 1830. Brian Ramel Ruiz is working with a number of very rare documents that very rarely are, for their part, dealt with by scholars. Peter Hinks deserves credit for giving us the most reliable edition of David Walker's appeal, and as well as resurrecting, can we say, this testimony from Lanson. And can I ask, how much of it is actually
resurrected? It's only resurrected in terms of the people who were reading it back in 1829 and 1830. It's been pretty. It's just something I fortunately stumbled on. These statements from Lanson were actually little, very brief essays that he wrote, and I assume paid to have inserted in local newspapers. And so that's where I'm allowed to understand what his thinking is about what's going on. And in fact, I get information about what's going on and the charges against him from his own statements. But it's this is a person who does not roll easily for detractors, and he simply refused to accept the idea that the people who were in this neighborhood he'd done so much to create were sort of by nature degraded people. And he was very willing to give a sympathetic portrayal of them, not one sort of like, oh, they have to be understood because they've had so much affliction that they're just sort of downcast and corrupt despite themselves. And no, he said largely the people who are in this community are good, decent, simple, ordinary people.
And your work on Lanson is actually much more extensive than you.
Yeah, I have much more on this, and I could I burdened Julie and John with an excessively long essay that has much more information about this. And his willingness really to defend this community that is being denounced terribly, as I said before. So over there in the new township, we have the fires of hell constantly burning before us, brightly orange. Given the sort of absolute character of a lot of the pronouncements that are written about the degree of vice that existed.
But my point here is that from your longer work, we get a stronger sense of him as a writer.
Yes.
As opposed to the little strips that you read today in your book.
More about that, yes, yeah. And his willingness to give a kind of black voice that would serve to counter what is an exclusively white perspective, to use a sort of a kind of dualism like that, to counter what's exclusively a white perspective on the nature of the black community over in New Township.
Okay, well, even as we're getting these new black voices and black text re-examined, we're also having a rereading and reevaluation of white authored documents written either for or against, and sometimes bizarrely, I think both at once, both for and both against the slave trade and slavery. White authors like Jefferson and Samuel Hopkins have been pressed as never before for their view on slavery, race relations, black people. A third factor here, I think, in the how and what we're seeing is recent scholarship on black communities and black societies in various places in the Atlantic world. Julie Winch has written on Black Philadelphia. This morning we heard about connections with Angola. Fourth factor is the rise of the early republic itself, as shown in the Journal of the Early Republic as a field of study. For the why, for the last of my three questions, here I think of the obvious fact that as we understand the American Revolution better, we must think that the lives of African Americans must have had interaction with the Revolutionary era that gave them qualities and experiences that they could not have had in other times. In other words, there was a kind of unique black experience of the Revolutionary period. We should also note that as the limitations, I think probably we would say the moral and the practical limitations, and influential ones at that, of the antebellum abolitionists have become evident, their predecessors, in other words, before 1830, have come into higher relief. And perhaps one last point is that in African American studies of the last 2 decades or so, notions of the black vernacular and the persistence of folk culture have become so prominent that anyone who looks clearly at writings by blacks before 1830 would be struck, of course, by the lack of vernacular and the lack of folk culture. Black writers of this generation, in fact, were drawn to the highest levels of Anglo-American culture. Milton, the Church of England, Edwardian Calvinism, the classics like Virgil. One of the most favored forms of writing of this generation was the petition, something with a very distinguished history in Anglo-American politics. So we don't find very much folk culture in this generation. Now, to pass on to the papers we have just heard, I'd like to say something methodologically about Peter Hinks's paper and something about the content of Brian Ramel Ruiz's paper. Peter Hinks has shown, it seems to me, that it is possible to combine some of the scholarly efforts I have just noted, particularly the recovery of texts, a close reading of them, and a focus on changing, indeed declining race relations in the early republic, with an effort to craft a microhistory. And this, of course, comes out of the fact that my response here derives partly from having read a much more extensive work than we just heard delivered a few minutes ago. In the last few decades, historians, including some notable historians of early America, have written intensive studies of single episodes or series of events so as to explore large historical questions through an analysis of individual people and specific experiences. This is now called microhistory. This kind of writing tells a story, very clear narrative line, adduces a very dense body of evidence. I'm thinking of Peter's work right here now, and for whatever reasons, seems to be well suited to the all but forgotten or improperly forgotten inhabitants of the past. Here, I want less to repeat Peter Hinks's conclusions than to suggest some black contemporaries of William Lanson who might provide new scholars opportunities for similar microhistories, or alternatively, who might show us the limitations of evidence in studies of African Americans of the colonial and revolutionary eras. My comments will have to be brief, just a little overview of some opportunities I think are there. Let's begin with a Bostonian, Prince Hall, founder of the African Masonic Lodge. The documentary record on Hall himself is not extensive, though there is more on the Masons themselves, but it is rich in meaning and significance. His writings were produced on the run, as it were, so we have a strong sense of black life in Boston as it was happening, and in a response to the growing hostility in the public sphere to black people. Hall chronicled this decline of race relations in the late 18th century just as it was happening. And this sense of writing on the run will be important in a moment when I talk about Richard Allen. However, there is the problem that the most extensive of his compositions was read by scholars like Charles Wesley, a very famous writer in early African-American scholarship, in the 20th century, but is not now available to the scholarly community. We know from contemporary commentary that Hall ran a successful catering business and that he was patronized by some of Boston's elite. There's a wonderful description of his culinary art at the time. His specialty was sea turtle ragu. And in less politically correct times, we could eat the sea turtle. Now I think we are obliged not to. But he would create the stew out of the sea turtle meat, place it in the shell of the sea turtle, carry it on his up in his hands or on his shoulders or something like that, and have men following him, serving it to the various patrons. So there's a great description of it from the time of his art and his technique. What I would just like to speculate about is there evidence of the type that Peter Hinks has adduced that would allow us to understand this enterprise both in itself and in relation to white commercial efforts, as there is for Lanson. In other words, was there competition? Was there white animus against this business? Did people try to undercut it or undermine it? Did he have patrons that helped him at one time but then turned their backs on him later, as we see in the case of William Lanson? So it was a profitable business that supported him and employed a number of other black people and gave them a kind of spectacle that they could perform in serving the turtle ragu. And what do we have out there in the less narrative, less public set of records that will help us understand this? There's a topic, in other words, waiting for a scholar. Let's continue with Richard Allen, Philadelphian, Delawarean, Philadelphian, and first bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Here, it seems we have all the makings of a social history, perhaps even a microhistory. But do we have the documents? I think at first glance it seems so. But my own view is that in contrast to Lanson, and this was the contrast I was trying to set up a moment ago, my view is that Allen's documents are very unreliable, and that we know quite a lot about him as a social being. In other words, we know a lot about the Philadelphia context, thanks in part to Julie Winch, but we barely know him intellectually, religiously, morally. The reason is the nature of his major publication, his autobiography, which is the very negative of Hall's writings, in not having been written on the run, but at the very end of his life. He died in 1830. It was dictated in 1829 to his son. The few brief sermons and devotional writings of his that survive similarly come to us very late, obviously highly edited. There's very little of Allen's that was produced with much control by the author himself, and very little that dealt with current events. So in other words, I think the social context is knowable, but the man himself remains an enigma. And I think, therefore, it doesn't seem to me that we have an opportunity there for the kind of detailed microhistory that Peter Hinks is working on with Lanson. So if Prince Hall is an opportunity, Allen is, then it seems to me, a counterexample or a limiting case. Let's finish then with Rhode Island blacks of the years between 1784 and 1824, discussed today by Brian Ramel Ruiz. Here, there is an extensive documentary trail produced on the run in a contemporary edition, late 20th century edition, about 200 pages of printing, plenty of interaction with whites that may provide further evidence. And this is my own guess, based on having read these documents, but not looked for the particulars of a very dense body of evidence, records of life, birth, baptism, labor, marriage, illness, crime, death, all of which can be used in crafting a microhistory. So, in other words, what I think is underneath this set of relatively available documents, there probably is a whole set of other records that can allow us to craft these very detailed histories. It may be that a new generation of writing on African American history is on the way, and that the kinds of work we've listened to today are part of that movement. In No, I said I'd like to speak about Peter Hinks's method, and that had to do with microhistory and opportunities. I said also that I'd like to speak about some content or some vocabulary in Brian Ramel Ruiz's paper. So let's move on to that. In his paper, we hear an echo of one of the important debates about the American Revolution. The issue is, for blacks as well as for whites, in what sense were the people of this generation whom we are studying liberals, or even as he said, Brian said, libertarian? This was a debate in historiography, late 1970s, early mid-1980s. I think the debate never reached conclusion, but people just rather got worn out. So it's hardly a hot topic anymore in history or political science. It was known as the Republican-liberal debate. It still survives in literary studies, and I think probably it should be more vital in religious studies. In any event, one view is that at the onset of the revolution, liberalism, in the sense of individualism and a disregard of traditional norms of social cohesion, hierarchy, patricianism, and patronage, was merely one strand in a complex ideology and was pressed on and severely limited by other kinds of ideas and values. Yet, by the beginning of what we call the antebellum period, Americans had cast off these older constraints and really were liberals in a modern sense. This development was one of the utmost important in race relations, because by 1830, Americans, both black and white, were able to articulate notions of black men as independent entities who would never be connected to whites by ties of affection, benevolence, sentiment, charity, unity, virtue. In other words, an older vocabulary that would tend to favor social cohesion, and that was in fact the very vocabulary used by the earliest black abolitionists, really faded away out of American political discourse and left us with the idea of everybody as a ideally a free person. As Gordon Wood wrote in his Radicalism of the American Revolution, then this made slaves actually all the more abominable. Once we have done away with all the various gradations in between and the ties that bind, and we assume everyone is ideally free, then those who are not free somehow become kind of a corrupting, polluting influence in society. Indeed, it was the accomplishment of the American Colonization Society to spread this notion, and it seems unlikely that mid-19th century abolitionism would have made any progress in American society had it articulated 18th century notions of a post-slavery society. In other words, abolitionism would have been too hot a topic, I think, had it retained its 18th century sentimentalism and organicism, and only once it became firmly committed to a liberal point of view could it really spread in America. The point I want to make in response to Brian Ramel Ruiz's paper is that, yes, the blacks he is studying were opposed to the slave trade and to slavery, and yes, they did want to be free, and yes, some of them did want to live in Africa, but they were not liberals or libertarian in a modern sense. Although some would disagree, and this recalls this old debate from the 70s and 80s, my own view is that some of the white luminaries of the revolution were not liberals. Paine and Jefferson are good examples. Samuel Hopkins, the abolitionist whom Brian referred to today, was probably the anti-liberal incarnate. On the English side, Granville Sharp is a good example of someone who was deeply conservative in theology and political thought, but sharply opposed to the slave trade and slavery. Yet all these people were for freedom, and in Hopkins and Sharp's cases, for black freedom. What all these men shared was not a commitment to a conservative society in the sense of an authoritarian society, but a commitment to a conservative society in the sense that it would be bound together by ties of affection, benevolence, virtue, charity, and unity. And this they shared with their black contemporaries. This was exactly the language that blacks of the early 18th century, late 18th century and early 19th century tried in the current lingo to leverage for the cause of abolitionism. The blacks Brian Ramel Ruiz is studying were influenced by forces that we might today call conservative, but we should never describe, that we would never describe as liberal. These forces include a new divinity theology, the kind of arch Calvinism of the late 18th century, George Whitfield's evangelizing, also Calvinistic, the Huntingdonian connection, Calvinistic Methodism, along with, I should add, a hostility to Islam with some roots in American Calvinism. Their method of reading the Bible used the most conservative hermeneutics available. Their politics were conservative. Early black abolitionists on this side of the Atlantic were Federalists. On the other side, they were not true Tories per se, but they were certainly believers in imperial power, which they saw, and actually prophetically so, could be used against the slave trade and slavery. The writers of the Black Atlantic, in which Brian Barmel Ruiz properly places his subjects, did everything they could to resist a society that was liberal in the modern sense. They argued for the importance of affection, benevolence, charity, and sentiment. They argued for the importance of a strong protective government, whether a national federal government as here, or an imperial government as in the British case. They argued that freedom was beneficial not in and of itself, but because it allowed people to be better spiritually and thus better socially. Most of them saw all these social goods as interracial in nature, though the Nova Scotians who settled in Freetown were influenced by a utopian notion of recreating the Garden of Eden in Africa with blacks as the new Adams and Eve. So there was a black-only thrust involved with the settlement of Freetown. Most of this generation was attracted by an orderly and hierarchical society led by patricians and ultimately by strong federal or imperial governments. Most of this generation feared untrammeled freedom simply because they knew what whites were capable of when they were not restrained. So in other words, they were not libertarians. Indeed, this black generation perceived on the horizon some elements of the 19th century that whites had not yet noticed, that it would be very hard in American political culture to avoid the claim that freedom for white people entailed the freedom to own black people as property, and that it would be far more force from above, that is, the actions of a federal or imperial government, that would terminate the slave trade and slavery than would ever be the free will of white Americans or white Britons in their daily interactions. If we think of blacks of the late 18th century and early 19th century as liberals, we cannot understand their influences, their vision of the end of slavery, and the post-slavery society they desired. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, I'd like to thank both of our presenters and our commentator. We have about 20 minutes for questions, and I would encourage you, if you have a question, please to identify yourself before you address our panel. Questions? I see a hand over there. Yes.
My name is Joanne Lloyd, and I'm a graduate student at Boston College. My question is about William Lanson's source of authority. I've read Robert Warner's book, and he talks about Lanson as being a black king, governor.
It's probably not right.
It's not right? Okay.
That was easy. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest it. But for those of you who are familiar with the ritual of black governors in Massachusetts, colonial Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, there's several scholars, including Robert Warner, who did a really fine early 19th century work on the history of blacks in New Haven. It's a wonderful book. And he's really a sociologist. He wasn't a historian. And he's looking at this history because he's interested in studying race relations. And he's interested in speculating about how we might be able to improve them in a New England town, a New England city of the 20th century. And he talks about New Guinea, the neighborhood that Lanson formed, and the vital role that Lanson played in it, although he, quite frankly, does not talk at all in the detail that I do, because he didn't look at the sorts of sources that I did that give all the information about the scale of Lanson's property ownership over there and his involvement in other enterprises. I just frankly know much more about that than Warner did. Warner, drawing on information from other people, said that he basically imbibes all this information that's coming from sources in the 1820s about the sort of vital degradation of Lansing. And he's looking at all these white sources and other commentators on Black New Haven who draw on these white sources later in the 19th century. He's looking at he's using these white sources who are interested in getting rid of Lansing's community. They want him out of there because they want to do, this is urban renewal phase one. This is Negro removal, as Black said in the 1960s about the other way to construe urban renewal. This is Negro removal phase one that you see going on here. I couldn't help but think about the 1960s when I was looking at what happens to Lansing there in New Township. They want them out because they want they're going to do other things with that land. And he's grossly misrepresented, grossly. And more I feel comfortable basically relying on his explanation of what's going on here. These people are so uncomfortable with having blacks so close to this new affluent square they want to create. It's going to be near other manufacturing, small-scale manufacturing enterprises that will be developed after 1825, and which have no intention whatsoever of ever hiring a black man. They just want these people out. They want them gone. And are there some vice problems over there? Absolutely. We probably got soliciting. We probably got late-night drinking. But there's nothing unusual about this. And it's something that is Lansing readily acknowledges. White purveyors were probably more involved with than he was or any other black people who were selling spirits or making space available to white men and black women, or black men and white women, whatever. But Warner says that he was one of the sort of a latter-day black governor. And Warner and other later historians, most recently Shane White, use this as a way to say that Lansing really has his feet more in slave culture than he does in the culture of free individualism. It's just wrong. First of all, he wasn't a black governor. There's no evidence I see at all of him ever having been elected a black governor. In fact, I have no evidence, as far as I can tell, of the ritual continuing well into the 19th century, like Shane White and Joseph Reedy and other people say it did. They rely on evidence from, frankly, latter-day 19th century white antiquarians who are reminiscing on what life was like in New Haven. But it's also used to suggest that because he was a black king, he thus was more comfortable living in a world of vice, and living a kind of easygoing vice, drinking, lots of gambling, late-night dancing, wild music, and on and on. And so that particular dimension of grounding him in the world of vice, that he was a black governor, as far as I'm concerned, is absolutely wrong. That doesn't dismiss Robert Warner's book. It's a very important book. But he was wrong in that area. And other people continue to carry that mistake on into later historiography because they don't really do any research on it.
Okay, other questions?
Donald Fryer, a historic here, for Mr. Bramell Ruiz. You've made a point that the Newport leaders, black leaders, were African-born. Is there any clear pattern as to whether African-born blacks were more likely to migrate to Africa, or were American-born blacks more likely?
I haven't found sort of the exact data to sort of support that. It was just the presence of the African-born blacks as they were tapped by leaders like Samuel Hopkins to be sort of these conduits between African culture and European and Euro-American culture that fascinated me. I mean, it's something that I want to go deeper into. But at the moment, I could only sort of tap into sort of like Newport Gardner and John Kwame, because we have sort of evidence from sort of people like Samuel Hopkins and Ezra Stiles who document their sort of longer lives and how they were sort of transported from Africa to. But one of the things that I've found interesting is that places like Newport, that are seaport communities, seem to have sort of, and where there's this cultural give and take or sort of flow back and forth, seem to, I mean, that's one of the things that attracted me to this topic, was because of the way sort of the seaports were sort of like groundswells for sort of this initial colonization. But I want to sort of differentiate these colonization movements between the African colonization society. Those are the kinds of things that I was talking about where blacks become much more hostile to. But these earlier efforts seem to come from sort of seaport communities where there was sort of this flow back and forth between African culture and acculturation within the Atlantic world.
Other questions? Yes.
I'd like to focus on a tiny detail that each one of you used. I'm Helen Seeger from Nantucket. In the story of the Nova Scotians, an error was made by somebody who visited there to try to help organize the trip by calling the site Guinea, and that, she said, denoted slavery right away,
right,
and misled a lot of people. In Nantucket, the African American community, antebellum, was called New Guinea, as it was in New Haven. I've been interested in how the names of traditionally African American sections in antebellum American cities has come about. And I've often wondered whether this is a name that is given by whites to the black community that has meaning among the whites that's quite different from the blacks. And I've wondered whether there is a different name that the blacks who live there might have used. So I'm interested in this word Guinea. Were the whites in Nantucket and in New Haven saying this is a new form of slavery? Or what? I'm putting these two things together and coming up with a quandary. Can either of you help out?
Well, I mean, all I can say is that the point that you brought out was that when the lieutenant governor was calling the place Guinea, John Clarkson was quick to correct him because it did connotate slavery and the slave trade. And so he went out of his way to sort of like dispel that as a myth. But I wouldn't know how it... I mean, that's one of the things I'm also interested in, is sort of, at least later on with like benevolent societies and such, they're calling themselves African or Ethiopian,
yes,
and a sense of attaching, this is something that I actually wanted to ask Professor Mellish last night, is sort of this transitions between these words of like whether it's Negro or colored, but specifically at this time, as people are coming out of slavery, connotate or giving names that have African sort of connotations to them, or specifically African names. So that's what I could answer on the Nova Scotian side. I guess in the New Guinea sense, I mean, is that sort of a self-appropriated word in the community, or is it something that's designated?
I think it's more designated than it is. It's something they selected. When it starts, I'm not quite sure, but you see it in the 1820s that the neighborhood's called New Guinea. I wish I remembered that, or whether
Nantucket began to thrive.
Oh, if you drive down the Wilbur-Cross limited access highway in Connecticut that runs down into Fairfield County from New Haven, I'm always intrigued or interested when I get around Trumbull, or a town like that, Darien, in very, very affluent Fairfield County. There's a road that's running over the Wilbur Cross, Guinea Road. And I'm sure I know why it's called Guinea Road. It's because originally there was a marginal black settlement. I can almost guarantee you, and it got the name Guinea. They just called it Guinea. I've seen this in other areas in Connecticut, up around Ellington. There was a road outside of the old town of Ellington from the early 19th century. It's called Egypt Road. Guess why it was called Egypt Road?
In Pittsburgh, it was called Haiti.
Yeah. But these names, now Egypt Road, that's complicated. That could have also been self-selected. But New Guinea, as far as, I can't really speak with any authority on that, but I think it's something, I don't know exactly what its genesis is, but I think it's probably largely something that whites attached to it. Now, when Lanson moves out of the original New Township neighborhood, and he goes over into this what's then an isolated area by 1842, it will be purchased by one of the leading carriage manufacturers in New England, James Brewster. And so that one's out of here too in 1842. But when he moves there in July 1830 and announces the inauguration of this new section on July 7th, which is sort of Black July 4th, in many New England communities, they don't celebrate July 4th because generally what they would, if they attempted to celebrate with whites, it usually led to their getting beaten terribly. So they set 5th, usually the 5th, but in this particular occasion it was the 7th. And he called this new hotel, this settlement, this little enclave, the Liberian Hotel. He did. And he called it the Liberian Hotel because somehow he saw Liberia as being representative of African and African American independence. And he makes that very explicit in yet another one of his statements that he pays for in the newspaper.
I see a question there. You, sir.
Yes, okay. Thomas Dodin. First, I have a question, but first I want to respond to the Guinea question. I mean, there are dozens of Guineas and New Guineas on the landscape in New England, but you have to be very careful in a town like Framingham. What was originally quinne meadow, which means broad meadow with that native root, becomes Guinea meadow in the 19th century. So there are several places in New England where the native word quinne becomes Guinea to 19th century New Englanders who have lost that connection to native place names. But obviously, there are dozens of Guineas all over the New England landscape. But the question I wanted to ask was relative to Brian's presentation. You see any connection between, let's say, a pre-revolutionary, almost emotional attachment to an Africa? I mean, first of all, in the context that we have several spectacular suicides in New England where people obviously are intending to return home after death, and this is very much a part of their worldview. And Sheldon, who does this lovely history of Greenfield, Deerfield, that region, talks of a mother who spends her entire life collecting all these little items to take back to Africa, which she passes on to her son after she dies. And one doesn't know what was going to happen to them, but they spend their lifetime anticipating that at some point, this is in the 18th century, the pre-revolutionary period, they are going to be enabled to return to Africa. And we do have several examples, and unfortunately I came in late, so I don't know if you've cited them, of Rhode Islanders returning to Africa. One example I think is as early as the 1730s, an elderly couple who had served out their time and had come into a small legacy, who used their money to return to Africa. And this is mentioned in the newspapers, so they returned by vessel. And there's several other examples of New England Africans returning to Africa who have been enslaved. So is there any connection that you find between this sort of vague emotional sense of the homeland and what's happening in the early period you're looking at?
The thing that I would want to distinguish, because I did mention sort of the Massachusetts petition of some Africans who first were asking for their emancipation and then wanting to return to Africa.
Well, that's that, or being given 2 counties in the western part of the state, right? So if you can't send us home.
Right.
Give us Hamden and Franklin County to create our own place.
But the thing that I'm interested in are those, even in the pre-revolutionary period, when you have sort of Samuel Hopkins' initial effort to promote what is called the colonization society, and what it is that people like John Kwame and Bristol Yama want to do versus, to me, these are folks who don't necessarily want to just return like the people that you cited, which I think I need to find more about, but they also have an intention of sort of creating a different kind of sort of colony that is a fusion of the Atlantic world. What's interesting to me that that I'd like to find out more about is that, of course, they have these factories or castles that are these like hotbeds on the Atlantic littoral of Atlantic culture, and I would be interested. Would have these these colonies, had they materialized, had that same sort of fusion? I don't know. But I think that would be the one distinction that I would make between sort of the pre-revolutionary colonization movements, or the ones that we're trying to sort of, that are the seabeds actually of those. That would be, they're not just wanting to return to Africa, but they go with a particular intention.
Yes, precisely.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yes, lady here.
This is a question for everyone on the panel, and my question is, who would you say is the most accurate researcher, or what source would you recommend for someone who's interested in studying free people of color of the 1700s in the Boston area?
We need Jim Horton.
Yeah.
Peter.
Mr. Dennis in the back.
You're looking for sources?
Yes.
Do you know the names?
Do you have names?
Oh, I've already read Jim Horton, but I just wondered if
Jim's later anyway.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else that you can think of?
Well, there are articles. Peter's done a lot of research on that time period. He's looked at a lot of probate records.
Okay, I'll talk to him later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'd like to thank you all, and again, I would like to thank our presenters and our commentator.